Okay, well, welcome all and thanks for being aboard. Another Sunday morning, and I hope a treat this morning. I've had a very interesting idea for what I'm going to talk about. We'll see what you think. I'm doing a desktop recording because I think this one will probably have some interest far and wide. I hope so. It started actually reading a copy of New Scientist magazine. It's a really lively science magazine that I enjoy, and it often has really quirky, almost silly titles. You know, it's a bit irreverent. But anyway, I was just reading a piece about software and gene profiling and software programming that's able to sort of predict what a child is going to come out like. And in fact, the company that's got some patents on this are called Gene Peeks, Peeks, you know, like in peeking or taking a peek at something, having a quick look. Gene Peeks. And it started me thinking, really. I mean, you know, it's kind of almost a virtual individual there before the parents even have sex, never mind conceive. It's getting weird, isn't it? The world is getting weird in all sorts of ways, but here we've got a situation where you might start asking the question, where on earth does life start? You know, does it start with the profiling, like a concept? You know, the old joke, you know, you were just a glint in your father's eye. Well, you know, that's in a sense when you started. So here we've got a technological glint. Anyway, as I said, it got me just thinking really about the boundaries between life and death. Where does it start and where does life really begin? But actually the question I'm going to ask today is at the opposite end. Let's talk about death. Or the end, or actually not death. If you've read my book, Virtual Medicine, then you'll know, well, I hope you got the second edition. If you've got the first edition, I'm sharing this with you anyway now, so you're going to be up to speed. But chapter 14 in the second edition is called Biology Beyond Death. Now, one of the chapters in the first edition was called Biology Beyond the Skin, because that back in the 1990s, that was quite a catchy idea for a chapter. You know, that was the early days of science writing on the subject of human aura, energy fields, information fields, and so on. And so later on, I used that title, Biology Beyond the Skin, for a later chapter, twisted it to Biology Beyond Death. What do I mean? Well, I mean survival in some form or other. Now, here I've got to tell you that even basic physics, but certainly advanced physics, will tell us quite clearly that we not only might possibly survive after death, but actually that we have to, by definition, by the science of physics, something of us must survive death. We are energy and information. And it's sort of basic, clunky physics that you can't get rid of energy and information. You can get rid of form, you know, so the body, the molecules of the body, they can disintegrate and go back to dust, you know, ashes to ashes, dust to dust and all that. But in terms of physics, the energy and information field shouldn't do that. So something survives. I'm not going to do past lives, but actually it's some kind of energetic or electronic survival. Now, I introduced that chapter, as I say, I don't know how many listeners have actually got the book and read the chapter, or even if you have, it might have been a while ago, you don't remember. But I introduced it with some rather startling words. Let me just read them to you. I've got a copy of the book in my hand, and then I'll tell you what's startling about them. These words, okay, quote, I think the problem is an impedance mismatched into that third transistor in the preamp unit. It can be corrected by using a 150 ohm 100 watt resistor in parallel with a 0.0047 microfarad ceramic capacitor. End quote. Well, I don't understand what that means, but I do know something special about those words, which is that they were spoken by a man who'd been dead for 14 years. He was called, and I don't mean a recording of him, I mean he spoke these words live in response to a question through an electronic device. The man was called George Mueller, and he was an electrical engineer. and he was engaged in a research project with a live man called William J. O'Neill, who was an inventor and an electronic technician. And the voice of this dead George Muller was coming out over a machine. He was trying to help O'Neill improve the qualities of the machine so that it became easier and clearer to respond to the dead. Okay? No, I'm not crazy. Honestly, all this was documented. In fact, Muller himself did his own authentication. They eventually found him. I've forgotten which university he was at. But, he supplied his biographical details. He even told them where to find his birth and death certificate records. He even provided his social security number. So, and there is an authentication PDF, which I posted in the book. I'll put a link under the recording for this so you can go and get that PDF, and it tells you who this man was and all about him. He really, really did exist. He was, that's right, I've written it myself, look, he was at the University of Wisconsin and Cornell University. He was an electronics engineer. Kind of fascinating, don't you think? Anyway, I'll come back to him later. But there's this whole phenomenon of electronic communication with dead entities. It's called EVP, standing for Electronic Voice Phenomena. And in some quarters, it's quite a big thing. Most people never heard of it. Certainly mainstream science, of course, wouldn't give it the time of day. They would just dismiss it as flim-flam. But the point is, these things have been recorded, and I've heard recordings of this kind. So, it's as good evidence as you're going to get. I suppose the only way of faking it is to have somebody, causing some kind of electronic intrusion that sounds like a recording, but isn't. But anyway, trust me that there's lots and lots of these. I mean, tens of thousands of these recordings, and they're certainly not all fakes. In fact, most of them are good people whose bona fides I know, would accept. And in fact, one of the earliest proponents is, he doesn't need bona fides. It's Thomas Edison, the guy who invented the electric light and phonograph, right? People that say, this electronic voice phenomenon isn't real should be reminded of a French scientist who told his colleagues, and I quote, "I have investigated," I'm not going to do a French accent, "I have investigated Thomas Edison's phonograph and can assure you it's nothing more than clever ventriloquism." That's the science of the day back then. Anyway, as it said, in the last part of his life, Edison was very interested in these things, and he was trying to build a machine, and he worked with his assistant, this guy called Miller Hutchinson, and they were both very convinced it was going to work. Edison himself wrote, and I'm quoting Edison, "If our personality survives, then it's strictly logical or scientific to assume that it retains memory, intellect, other faculties and knowledge that we acquire on this earth. Therefore, if we can evolve an instrument so delicate as to be affected by our personality as it survives in the next life, such an instrument, when made available, ought to record something." Well, I was telling you the story of the Spiritcom, and that was an attempt to sort of get a specialised machine or improve on it. But I've got to tell you that a lot of this comes from simple things. Those little handheld dictaphone recorders that you can buy, for example, Olympus and Sony, Panasonic do them. Some people, and there are certain preconditions I will explain, but some people can do this by just switching one on and leaving it on the bedside to stand overnight, and they find in the morning there are recordings. As I said, a little bit of preliminary work which I'll come to, but let me tell you some of the history of this, because it's really interesting, an interesting story, and a very real story. It's not a history of flakes and weirdos at all. Let's go back to 1936. There was an American photographer called Attila Fonsale. Attila, like, Attila the Hun. But he began experimenting right back in the very beginning of recordings, that when they were cutting records, they would actually warm the wax and cut the record as they heard the sound. And he had some success at capturing spirit voices like that. In the 1940s, there was better equipment. You remember they moved on to what was then a wire recorder. It was the precursor of our modern tapes, electromagnetic tapes. It was just done on wire. The wire was spooled through very rapidly and picked up the magnetic signals and held it. So a bit primitive, and yet still, to a degree, it worked. In 1949, there was an Italian guy called Marcello Bacci, and he used an old radio vacuum tube and was able to get tuned in, and it was like voices coming through on the radio. You know, the white noise you can sort of get between radio stations and so on. Sometimes that white noise would surrender some voices. You know, a voice would come out of the background. It was really interesting. And let me tell you about another couple of guys in the 50s. These were Catholic priests. Now, you know, the Catholic Church doesn't fanny around with these things. It doesn't like anything to do with spiritualism or ghosts or witchcraft or weird things. It's considered demonic or satanic. But no, not in this case. There was a couple of Catholic priests, a guy called Ernetti and a Father Gemelli. They were both interested in music, actually, which is what got them started. But listen, Ernetti was an internationally respected scientist. He was a physicist, a philosopher, and, of course, a music lover. Gemelli himself was president of the Papal Academy. So, you know, neither of these guys are loonies or flakes. And yet, in a session, a music recording session, they were recording some Gregorian chant, you know, that sort of monk-type chanting. And the wire kept breaking on the device that they were recording on. And Father Gemelli, he kind of got a bit exasperated, a bit peed off, and he looked up to heaven for his father. You know, his father's dead. So he looks up and says, "Dad, for goodness sake, help out here." And to their absolute, total astonishment, his father's voice appeared on the magnetophone and said, "Of course I shall help you. I'm always with you." All right? This was, you know, they were struggling to get any recordings. There's no question of monkey business here. And what was the clincher was that this voice addressed Father Gemelli as Zucchini, which was his childhood nickname. His father used to use it when he was a kid, and nobody else could possibly have known that at the time. Well, of course, there could have been big trouble. What if, you know, his Father Pope, you know, His Holiness had said, this is all bad? But in fact, he didn't. And I've got a quote from him again. He told this to Gemelli, let me quote, "You really need not worry about this. The existence of this voice is strictly a scientific fact and has nothing whatever to do with spiritism. The recorder is totally objective. It receives and records only sound waves from wherever they come. This experiment may perhaps become the cornerstone for a building for scientific studies which will strengthen people's faith in the hereafter." Well, that was, you know, pretty eclectic and practical of him, wasn't it? Saying, "Oh, this could be a good thing, we might get more converts." But, you know, the point is, there was no trouble, but it was controversial, so they didn't actually publish until, well, Gemelli finally published in, I think it was the early 1990s anyway, when he, you know, it's like on his deathbed, that kind of thing. All of these studies and events were finally published. But things, I'm doing your history before I talk about it, right? But things started going, you know, hotting up quite a lot. In 1959, a Swedish film producer called Friedrich Jürgensen, he was taping bird songs and got voices. And lo and behold, his mother showed up as one of the voices. I mean, you know, a long dead mother, I mean. And she talked to him in German. And she said, "Friedrich, you're being watched," you know, and called him Friedel, my little Friedel. Again, that was a sort of childhood nickname that nobody in the present time when he was doing this could possibly have known, really. And he was convinced, of course, that he made an important discovery. Well, I should think so. Anyway, he published books, you know, Voices from the Universe, and then Radio Contact with the Dead. And that was interesting. The second book, Radio Contact with the Dead, was translated into German and then picked up by one of the most important figures in all of this, a man called Konstantin Rodiver. And he was pretty sceptical, but, you know, like me, saying, well, it could be baloney, but I'm going to find out. So he did. And he set up his own recording experiments, and he too picked up the voice of his mother. And eventually he did, tens of thousands of voice recordings. He was subject to experiment in 1971. Pi Records, P-Y-E, I think they're certainly British. I'm not sure if they're derivative of an American company or just the Dutch company. But anyway, it's like Sony or Panasonic in Japan now, today. They were a big sort of electronics concern back in the 50s and 60s. And obviously, I just realised, obviously still going by the 1970s, but you never hear about them these days. But they brought him into a sound lab and put special equipment in to block out any radio or television signals, no question or possibility of faking by outside transmissions. They wouldn't allow Rodiver to touch any of the equipment. There were 2 recorders, one that Rodiver was using, then there was another control tape recorder recording and watching everything that went on in the background. All Rodiver was allowed to do was speak into a microphone. And they taped his voice, 20 minutes or so of him talking. Nobody present, none of the engineers, none of the scientists, nobody there could hear anything except Rodiver speaking. Okay? But when they played the tape back, they fell off their seats in amazement because there were over 200 voices recorded at the same time as Rodiver's. Okay, now as I said, Konstantin Rodiver was a big cheese in this field because he developed it, and it does seem to be something that you kind of develop. I'll talk about the communication cloud or communication field in a minute, but so just back for a moment to the Spiricom story, right? A guy called George Meek put up some money. There was a group of investigators, in fact, and they were deliberately trying to create this two-way system, which they called the Spiricom. And it got rid of sort of the excessive background noise. It clarified and tuned the voice somewhat. And they collected all kinds of recordings. I mean, often there is a problem with EVP. I'm going to suggest, well, I'll tell you now, in fact, I was going to suggest later, but I'll tell you now. Go off to YouTube and type in the letters EVP, and you'll receive a list of all kinds of recordings and videos of people doing this EVP thing. And you will be struck by one of the common problems, which is the messages are so short, basically 2-3 syllables at the most, that, you start straining to hear what was being said, and maybe you wonder, was that just an imagination thing, And it was also complicated by the fact that some of these things are received in different languages. If you get just 3 words, you don't understand it, and 2 of the words are in German. You see the problem. But it happened that Konstantin Rodiver was a multilingualist and could speak, over a dozen languages. So he was able to pick up what was going on. But anyway, this guy, William O'Neill and his Mueller, Dr. Mueller, the dead man, eventually came up with this Spiricom design, and you can find it. It's out on the web. In fact, if you get stock, email me. I'll send you a link. I'm not sure where my copy is, but it's something that's been circulated in the world. People went to a lot of trouble to share this. They don't feel that it's something that somebody should own or patent, or it doesn't belong to anybody. It's a human sharing, a very generous position, in other words. And they've done the circuit diagrams for the Spiricom. I have not found anyone that's actually built one and got one. And if anyone listening knows where there is one, please give me a number and a name. I'd love to call the guy and go around and fool around with it. But their purpose basically was, for the good of mankind, and they warned, if you're going to be a sleazeball and try and turn it into money or do patents and things, that you're probably, when you finally die, shed your physical body, they said, then you'll start at the bottom, at the lowest astral plane. Ooh. Scary. Anyway, all right, enough of that. What about phone calls? Who's heard of that, I wonder? These some extraordinary, weird experiences for some people. The phone rings, they pick up the phone, and the voice says, "Hi, it's your dead mum." And it's mum or dad, It's his voice, it's not an actor, maybe been dead 20 years, but you'd recognise the voice, nobody else would, and starts talking to you. What do you make of that? Well, the first thing to point out is it's another kind of electronic device. I mean, the spirit, You remember we said in some of the early Sunday meetings that a spirit is by definition non-material. And non-material has a strict scientific definition. It means no matter, no energy, no location in space or time, no wavelength. If it has any of those things, then it is material, it is physical. But spirit is not, so it doesn't have any energy. So spirit has to somehow pick up a way of piggybacking energy. And in fact, you can hear these voices in things like dripping water. It just creates sound waves, and then you can hear voices on top of these sound waves. But of course electronics is very good. If you switch on a tape recorder and leave it running, there's all the energy a spirit would need to create a recording. And a bit the same with a telephone. The whole idea of a telephone is it's a sound amplification device that's going to make certain sound energies audible to the human ear. Anyway, it has been studied. There was a famous investigator called Scott-Rogo, D. Scott-Rogo. He catalogued all this in a book called Telephone Calls from the Dead. Now, I've got to tell you that Rogo ended up with a creepy, weird murder. You know, he was killed violently in strange circumstances. You've got to ask questions, haven't you? You know, like, was that just a coincidence, or, you know, what was that all about? But as I say, he catalogued a lot of calls, and they're very interesting. On one occasion, there's a lady called, let me tell you, a lady called Sarah Estep. She founded the American Association for EVP, and she received a call from Konstantin Rodiver, dead. He was dead by this time, right? But she'd met him, so she knew his voice. She got a call, and he said it was Konstantin Rodiver, and she was so shocked and stunned. She said, "Oh, how are you?" You know, as you might. And Rodiver apparently replied, "As well as can be expected for a dead man." I think it's rather witty. Anyway, you know, these things happen whether you're interested to pursue them and go and look for examples of your own. Obviously, you know, I'm going to be republishing this chapter in the new version. I keep telling you about the new version of Virtual Medicine, which will be called Medicine Beyond. So there'll be sort of expanded material on this, because I do think it's very fascinating. But let's move on to what you think now might probably be the obvious question: can this happen in computers? Well, if any of you have spent much time at the computer, and you know I make my living at the computer, I live at the keyboard night and day, that there are times when you're absolutely convinced there's some evil spirit in the computer, and it's doing everything it can to trash your good endeavours. But, you know, it's just as logical as the telephone thing or a tape recorder. Why not? It's an electronic thing. You boot it up. It's full of energy. A spirit may be able to manifest itself in that way somewhere. One of the most famous cases, also the most startling by far, it's back in the 80s, and it concerns an English school teacher called Ken Webster. And he had this haunted computer. He was a teacher, and he borrowed a very old BBC computer. I mean, we're going right back into the days of primitive, the beginning of everything. You know, there was floppy drives and things, but there was, you know, no modems, no internet, no networking or anything like that. And this thing had 32K of memory. 32K, I mean, goodness me. That's very, very little. It's almost a joke, but that's the state computers were in those days. Anyway, he and his girlfriend, Debbie, they went out one night. They left the computer running, left it switched on, went out. When it came back, there was a weird sort of message, a poem of sorts, they describe it as. They assumed it was a joke, but they just saved it to disk anyway. They thought somebody had, you know, broken in or popped in and typed up this joke and then vanished. So they, anyway, and on another occasion they borrowed another machine, a different machine, and another, really inexplicable communication was received that had a rather old-fashioned language flavour. It was like Elizabethan English, ye, using ye's and thous and all those things back from the old days. And it was rather threatening, actually, as being a bit nasty. So they treated it as a bad joke. In an attempt to catch the hoaxer out, they brought another computer home, and they did everything they could, to make sure it was clean. They pre-examined it, and then they left the house, and when they came back, there was another message of that type. On a whim, as it were, Ken Webster typed a reply, and to his astonishment, immediately got back another communication from the ghost, or the spirit, or whatever was in the machine. And he said his name was Thomas Harden. And they went on in correspondence, for years, for months. It lasted about 6 months, apparently. Apart from, a true electronic incarnation of the kind I'm talking about, there never was any, no other explanation. Nobody understood it. But this girlfriend, Debbie, seemed to be pivotal. First of all, the ghost seemed to rather fancy her. He fell for her, liked her. And nothing really odd, or no messages from beyond or anything like that happened unless she was in the vicinity. So, you've heard of the kind of poltergeist effect, which needs a certain person present, typically a young child. There's a sort of catalyst person. Well, in this story, Debbie, the girlfriend, was the catalyst for this man. People have theorised what this was about. Was he some ghost that was angry at these people who'd come to live in his old house? Anyway, if you're interested, there is a book on it. It's called The Vertical Plane, but I've got to warn you, it's selling for black market prices, hundreds of dollars. I have been too outraged to go and get myself a copy. That sort of price. It's a shame, and I hope somebody sooner or later breaks the copyright and puts a PDF version up on the net to become in the public domain. But let me tell you about the Reverend Jim Beesborough from Savannah. And no, I'm not going to try and do a southern accent, but he had this thing about computers. He thought they were devil machines, and he said if there's enough memory in there, then there's enough memory to hide Satan and evil spirits. You'd have guessed this guy was from the South anyway, wouldn't you? In fact, he said, any PC built after 1985 has the storage capacity to house an evil spirit. There you are. Don't laugh. Obviously his obsession with Lucifer has more to do with his own world view, really, but the point is that he has a little story too. He was sitting there at the keyboard of one of his parishioners' computers, contemplating a sort of computer exorcism, when apparently the computer woke up and objected to him. It switched itself on, and it began mocking him by typing out, and these are the words, right? "Preacher, you're a weakling and your God is a damn liar." And after that, the device went haywire, started printing out gobbledygook all over the place. Nobody could understand the text. But listen, let me tell you, this is interesting. Old Peasborough, later, he said he found an expert in dead languages and had them look at this gobbledygook text. And it said it turned out to be a stream of obscenities written in the year 2,800-year-old Mesopotamian dialect. Mesopotamia, Babylon and all that stuff. Some of this stuff is awesome, isn't it? I don't know what you're making of it, but it's just like, wow. I just strongly resist the temptation to say, oh, this is bunk. I think all this is exciting. And since I've gone to a lot of trouble to write up a healing and life paradigm that's based on information and energy, not stuff at all, the body, the material, it's all irrelevant. So I think I told you in one of the other Sunday talks of somebody who'd learned to operate a robot thousands of miles away. It responded to his thought intentions. The robot would move in a certain way. But he was fed back signals from the eyes of the robot. And pretty soon the man got the feeling he was the robot. He became embodied in the robot. I'm sure I told you that story. It's called embodiment. But isn't this a little bit like the same thing? Some poor, screwed up, messed up spirit finds itself in a computer somewhere and, and tries to communicate and wants to get connected. That's the model I'm seeing. I hope, you're all okay with this and you feel this is enough of spirit and life and consciousness things to be worthwhile. I love it, and I think it's very relevant to our Sunday meetings. Let me tell you perhaps, one more, a couple more. Kurt Cobain, the pop singer. There was a girl from England, a 24-year-old, and her laptop seemed to get the ghost of this, he was long dead by this time, and his image would appear on the screen in the computer. But what's really weird? It was only after the computer was switched off. And, she was, anyway, they did some kind of computer exorcism, apparently. The image has never been seen since, but then the damn computer's never worked since either. Strange story. Okay, let's do one last one, which is about stuff on radio and TV. Now, I remember myself years ago, 40 years ago, maybe more, watching TV. It was just one afternoon and I only had half my attention on the TV. And all of a sudden a voice broke in a strange language, really strong, powerful transmission, lasted about 90 seconds and then disappeared. And then BBC came on, one of their announcers apologised for what they called a technical hitch. Never any explanation, it was kind of some quirk of the ionosphere or something. But can you imagine the energy quantity that's needed to override BBC transmissions all over the UK? That was back in the days when, there was one BBC nationwide. It always left me a bit mystified as to what power could possibly have done that. So, was it a ghost in the machine? Or, as some people I'm sure will think, maybe it was aliens, trying to transmit and breaking into the BBC transmissions. I don't know, but anyway, just to finish, one last example of radio. This is Radio Luxembourg. Luxembourg, the little country in the middle of Europe, it has a radio station which was hugely popular in Britain because it was outside all the normal laws and rules and regulations of what you could and couldn't do on air. It's very tightly controlled, but Luxembourg could do what it wanted, and it ran all kinds of programs and advertisements and things that wouldn't legally have been allowed in England itself. And anyway, 1983, a man called Hans Otto Koenig was brought onto the program because he was using these kind of communication devices, low-frequency oscillators, lights, and he was working in ultraviolet, infrared range and so on. Anyway, he was introduced by the host, Rainer Holbe, and Holbe had Koenig set up all his stuff, under the close supervision of all the engineers. And then one of the engineers asked if a voice had come through in direct reply to a question, and apparently a discarnate voice jumped in over the system. He meant somebody in the room test, right, and said, a discarnate voice said, "We hear your voice. Otto Koenig makes wireless contact with the dead." That's what it said, and this was on air. Holbe was just stunned, and he was addressing millions of listeners all across Europe. And he said, "I tell you, dear listeners of Radio Luxembourg, and I swear by the life of my children that nothing has been manipulated. There are no tricks. It's a voice, and we do not know from where it comes." The station issued an official statement, of course, not a denial. I mean, they just simply said, every step had been carefully supervised, and they had no explanation, but it was clearly not fakery. It was, it was far too well controlled. Okay, so I suppose you might be thinking, is this real? Can I have a go at this? I mean, I was excited. I rushed out and bought a recorder when I first learned about this kind of stuff. And the answer is that you can. There's all sorts. You can use any kind of tape recorder, for example. They all say, these investigators all say, that the old reel-to-reel type recorders are the best. And to a degree that applies to, the modern cassette, which is a kind of reel-to-reel. But the big reel-to-reels do seem to give the best quality. But, you can use, as I said, those little digital pocket recorders, like, $50 or $60. Sony do them. There was one that was recommended. I can't remember the model, so I can't help you. But if you got your copy of Virtual Medicine, turn to page 255 and it will tell you what Sony model. And all you do is simply, switch on and wait. But, and this is the important thing, you have to build up some rapport. Very occasionally it works first time, but mostly it's a question of building up rapport. It's as if, and I'm only saying as if, it's as if you're building up trust from the other side that whatever it is causing these voices will, in time, come to talk to you. And it does seem to be a field effect. You have investigative groups where everybody's tuned in, everybody's on the case, and they get results that are far ahead of beginners, that beginners have to kind of get up to speed, as it were. And also, by the way, if there's quarrelling and arguments and bad things going on in the environment, it tends not to work. These groups, when they start bitching and falling out with each other, then the voices disappear for weeks or months at a time and won't come back until harmony is restored. So, if you don't decide to give it a go, you just switch on some device and you've got to announce yourself, say, this is Keith, Scott-Mumby. I'd love to hear from anyone who's out there, anyone who wants to make contact in any way. Please leave me a message. I shall be listening to this recording. Leave me a message and tell me what you'd like me to know. That sort of thing. You could say it a couple of times, but, over the days and weeks, the idea is that you build up a frequency of contact and you build up a rapport, I suppose is the best word. Yeah, just a rapport. The model we're using is that it really is discarnate beings on the other side, discarnate beings that have otherwise lived, because many of them do have memory and contact with things that happened on Earth, either names or places or experiences. Give it a shot, and I'd love to share with you. I've got quite a few recordings, if anyone is absolutely mad keen interested and can't find enough on YouTube or on the internet. There's plenty out there. I do have some CDs which I could turn into MP3s and upload them, I guess. But, do a bit of research of your own. If you go to YouTube, like I said, you will hear EVP quite often associated with the electromagnetic phenomenon called orbs. Now, I don't know if you know orbs, but that's, sort of glowing balls of light, energetic balls that move around in the environment. And it's often been speculated, shall I say, I put that speculation in the new book, Medicine Beyond, that these are some kind of life form, then not just energy, but there's some intelligence in them. Anyway, you'll see some people with recordings. You can see the glowing lights moving around, and you can definitely hear sounds. Some of them require a bit of imagination to hear what the investigator thinks they're hearing, and then others are quite clear. It is obvious kind of what they said. Very fascinating. And as I said, you can do this for yourself. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there for the talk. I'll open the lines and we can have questions, but I'm recording the talk, so that's the end of it officially. And if you want to know more, go and investigate or Google it yourself, get some equipment, see what you can do, or just wait for the new edition of Medicine Beyond, which hopefully won't be more than a few weeks into the future. That's great. Thanks very much for listening so far.